Now, as we turn away from individual explanations for why poverty exists, that means looking at wider factors, at structural factors, and that means looking at the Canadian economy as a whole. The fact is, we have periods during which the economy seems to go down the drain. We have periods when the economy seems to be in an upswing. That means there's going to be periods with lower rates of unemployment and periods of higher rates of unemployment. During a downturn or a full fledged recession, people lose their jobs. It's as straightforward as that. If there's not enough work, there's not enough work. And that definitely contributes to more people living at or below the low income cutoff at a structural level. In addition, structural factors contributing to the rate of poverty include looking at how social policies affect poverty levels by either contributing to them or maintaining them or alleviating them. The social policies in Canada or any country are going to affect the well being of the population. It's estimated that about 5 million people in Canada, that's one out of every 7 individuals, currently live in poverty, below the low income cutoff. So this is a widespread issue across the country and the world, and especially for vulnerable groups such as people living with disabilities, single parents, elderly people, youth, and racialized communities are much more susceptible. Now, maybe you have heard that women are more likely than men to live in poverty for a few reasons. This is referred to the feminization of poverty, and it's not a myth. This is a term that's used quite regularly in the social sciences, referring to the theory that women are more likely to be low income earners than men, and that the income gap between men and women is growing. In other words, that women experience poverty at a disproportionately higher rate than men. So the gap between the lower class and the upper class has widened. This is the same idea, but the gap is based on gender. This term, feminization of poverty, first emerged in the 70s and it's undergone some change. Yes, it is still likely that women are more likely to be low income earners than men. That has not changed. However, while there is an income gap between men and women, it's no longer growing. And there's an entire range of reasons to explain why women are more likely to be poor than men, a whole range of risk factors. These include the gender wage gap in some professions. Women tend to be more likely to be concentrated in lower paid occupations. They might have a lack of work family supports, even though women are still predominantly responsible for children. And even just challenges involved in accessing public benefits. Historically speaking, employment opportunities were more limited for women, not just in Canada and the US, but worldwide, so that women just didn't have the same opportunities for financial independence as men. Now, there's been major growth in women's employment, but in some areas of the world, the quality of the jobs available to women still remains deeply unequal. We know that women continue to shoulder the majority of responsibility for raising children. And what does this mean in terms of their work? What this means is they tend to leave the labor market for periods of time during which they might lose some of their labor security. So they won't be as current in their job as other employees. Maybe they'll lose contracts because they've taken time off to have children. All of the problems that you can imagine that might go along with leaving your work for a few years, or even just for the standard maternity leave, might result in women having less labor security. Women are more likely to take time off work as children are growing, again affecting the security of their employment as well as their chances for promotion. But in addition, women, because of this, are more likely to spend fewer years in the paid labor force, so that in retirement, they're likely to have a smaller pension to rely on than men, and they're likely to have saved less for their retirement than men, to have invested less. So all of these individual factors collectively mean that it results in women being more likely to be poorer than men. And even the fact that women tend to live longer than men adds to this, because it means that in retirement they need more savings, even though they're saving less. So let's bring this back to theory, which I know just thrills you to pieces. Let's bring this back to conflict theory. And I want you to consider, is there any way to avoid this? What would a sociologist say about, is there any way to avoid this inequality in society? Or is it just necessarily a part of living in a group of people, living in a community, in a society? What would conflict theory say? Yes, yet again, I'm going to talk about conflict theory. Remember, it focuses on economic inequality and how that creates social inequality. How the upper owning class do what they can to maintain their status and maintain their own interests, and how the lower working class want to maintain their own interests. And because of this, you have conflicting interests. Conflict is inevitable. On one hand, yes, Marx said that conflict between the classes was inevitable. There's no way to avoid it because each has their own interests and each wants to do what they can to advance their own interests. And I understand that. I think in part because to me that's just common sense. If I want A and you want B, we're not going to see things the same way. Of course, the factory owner is going to have different worries. They're going to have different concerns. They're going to have different things that are important to them compared to a factory worker. But Marx also strongly believed that this struggle would eventually result in a society without struggle. That this class struggle would eventually play itself out and lead to a society that would no longer have different classes, and therefore class conflict would be eliminated. It just wouldn't be there anymore. Because remember, he thought that eventually the lower class would have enough. They'd be fed up. They'd be so tired of being on the lower rung of social stratification that all workers would band together and unite and rise up against the upper class. Now, in talking about conflict theory in relation to stratification, we're going to get into a little bit more detail. I don't think I need to get into more detail about what an economic class is. But for Marx, he was really specific about what an economic class is. He said your economic class is determined by your relationship to the means of production and your income. Where does your income come from? If you're the owner, then you have a close relationship to the means of production. You own them. And your income is determined by how much profit you make. The source of your income is that profit. You're focused on profit, which means you want to keep expenses down. But if you're an employee, you do not have an actual relationship to the means of production. And your source of income is your paycheck. So to maximize your income, you want to make as much as possible, and you want the best working conditions possible. Pretty straightforward. Now remember, yes, so here we have the upper owning class, the bourgeoisie, and the lower working class, the proletariat. So these are the terms that Marx used to describe the two classes. He referred to the upper owning class as the bourgeoisie, and he referred to the lower working class as the proletariat. And I don't have a trick for remembering these, which word goes with which class. You'll just have to remember them. And from Marx's view, he predicted that what would happen in an industrialized society was that the upper class would begin to shrink. He said the bourgeoisie would grow smaller, but even though there's going to be fewer in the owning class, they're going to control more of the wealth. He said necessarily the number of employees would grow. So there won't be as many owners. There's going to be more employees in the world. But that smaller number of owners, that smaller number of bourgeoisie are going to control more and more of the world's wealth. So, for example, the proletariat would become poorer and poorer because of the owning class's desire to keep their profits up, their source of their income as high as possible. And of course, the proletariat would try to keep the wages that they earn as high as possible. So Marx said you're going to have these two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The gap between them is going to grow and grow. The rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer. Has this happened? Yeah. Income disparity has continued to grow, and this is part of the basis of the 1% protests, also known as the Occupy Wall Street movement that began in 2011 in New York. It was focused on the influence of big corporations on government and social and income inequality. So the slogan they used, "We are the 99%, was used to refer to income inequality and wealth distribution in the US between the wealthiest 1% of the population who control the majority of wealth and the rest of the population. Now, not all of Marx's vision of the future came to be, however. In a previous lecture, I talked about how Marx didn't account for the growth of the middle class and the various layers of social class that eventually developed. Instead, he stayed focused on these two general classes, the upper and lower, completely opposed to each other, with very little in between them. And he focused on the proletariat, the lower working class, almost like a volcano. And he felt that this discontented proletariat would eventually get more fed up and more fed up and more fed up. And they would eventually erupt like a volcano with the workers of the world uniting. And this would cause a new kind of society to emerge in where everybody would be equal, eliminating the need for class struggle. This has not happened. It just didn't. Because he didn't envision a few things. He didn't predict the effect advances in technology would have for much of the working class. Marx stayed stuck on this kind of Charles Dickens stereotype of a filthy, physically unhealthy workday full of coal and smoke and exhaust and dirt from dawn to dawn. You know, not a lot of breaks. He didn't anticipate that work days would be regulated, that working conditions would improve, that there'd be fewer hours. Simple things that we all take for granted because now it's the norm to have regulations regarding safe and healthy working conditions. Marx didn't anticipate the development of a welfare state with employment insurance and health benefits, or that workers would have the right to strike, or that workers would have better and more consistent access to health care. So the effect of all this was that it essentially let some of the steam out of the volcano so that it wouldn't erupt, so to speak. All of this has, what we see from a conflict theorist's perspective, it's kind of pacified workers. It's provided them and their families a better standard of living overall, so they haven't revolted and risen up together in the way that Marx predicted. Now, of course, we're analyzing and criticizing his predictions with the benefit of hindsight, which is quite easy to do.